Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for your attention today. And gentlemen, thank you for joining me on this, which should be a very enlightening panel. We're going to make this a little more personal and pragmatic. Okay. And so we're going to share some of our experiences. What many of you may not know, that in 1996, Young and Jung published a paper on cryptovirology, which basically provided the technical architecture for ransomware. 20 years later, a little more than 20 years later, last spring, we had probably the largest outbreak of ransomware ever with the WannaCry malware. And some estimates said it infected over 250,000 computers. These weren't just the teenagers at home running BitTorrent or her mom and dad running the wrong attachments, but this took places like NHS in England and knocked it out of service. They had to turn patients away. So today what I wanted to ask each of our illustrious panelists about some of their experiences with ransomware. So first, Mitch.
Thank you. So I think the biggest takeaway for the DoD with larger recent breakouts of ransomware, such as the WannaCry incident, really is related to a recognition or kind of like recalling once again to ourselves how intertwined we are with our commercial partners, and that's probably relevant to most of the business organizations represented in this setting. So while the DoD's cybersecurity infrastructure and processes was adequate to keeping WannaCry off of DoD systems, some of our commercial partners were in fact impacted, and therefore this presented a mission risk to the department. Stepping back for a second, the department has long recognized that our competitors and adversaries might try and gain an asymmetric advantage against DoD's formidable military technologies and capabilities by attacking us through our supply chain and getting at our intellectual property and what have you within our defense industrial base. This was kind of the WannaCry was kind of unique in that it really represented a more criminal oriented exploit that still was able to impact commercial partners that we're depending upon. Our approach to trying to manage both risks to our intellectual property and to managing these kinds of problems have been built around an engagement with industry. We'll talk more about that. Includes both being clearer about our cybersecurity requirements in our contractual relationships with commercial industry, as well as developing a robust threat information sharing arrangement with industry that we'll talk more about. I would point out to this group that the NIST has developed a very useful cybersecurity framework, the framework for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity that we would commend to the public here, which actually enables commercial industry and in particular critical infrastructure owner-operators to holistically understand cybersecurity risks.
Chris.
Great, thank you. In leading up to this panel, you said say something provocative. The best thing I could come up with is go Cubs. Is that all right? Regarding ransomware, the U.S., I believe, has dodged a bullet. You only have to look back to the WannaCry incident over the Mother's Day weekend this year. Terrible implications across the EU, and except for a handful of companies here in the U.S., we by and large dodged a bullet. Why? I think because of increased attention to patching, to workforce awareness, to organizations' willingness to align cyber risk with business risk. And our ability at HHS, at least for the healthcare sector, to work with our partners like NHISAC and HITRUST and others to alert the sector when there's a threat, a ransomware threat to the organizations. Imagine a public health emergency not generated by a hurricane or wildfires, but by a cyber incident where a large swath of medical devices could not be used and patients had to be turned away or scheduled somewhere else for service. Imagine radiologists not being able to read critical CT scans or other images and having to delay care to a large portion of the population. That's what worries me about ransomware. That's why FDA, NIH, CDC, and the operating divisions at HHS are working with our vendor partners, our strategic partners, to illuminate the problem, to align it with business risk, and then to take meaningful actions to prevent it.
As you mentioned, information sharing, I think, is really a crucial element in fighting ransomware. In my role, both in the public and private sector, I get to travel around the world. I've noticed many other nations seem to be ahead of the U.S. in terms of industry-government partnerships when it comes to information sharing. That's not to say that we don't have it, it just doesn't seem to be as pervasive. One of my personal views is that the risk of litigation holds industry back from sharing things. So I'm interested from both of your perspectives, your thoughts in terms of how we can improve information sharing so we can address these problems. Mitch, first with you.
Thank you. So the DoD has a long-standing collaborative relationship with its defense industrial base for the protection of DoD intellectual property. And we've developed really a multi-pronged approach. Over the years in implementing the strategy, which includes quite a bit of to and fro sharing of threat information, sharing underlying artifacts that will enable the department to better understand exactly what occurred when an incident occurs, we've had to overcome a concern about litigation risk. Most of the time, these were centered on reasonable concerns about indirectly sharing information that is protected either by privacy concerns or protected by third-party contractual rights. Ultimately, we've been able to overcome these concerns based upon essentially the trust in the relationship and the value to the collaborating parties. The DoD's approach to the protection of its information in the hands of its industry partners, multi-pronged. So one, there is a threat information sharing arrangement where we have a focal point within the Defense Cyber Crime Center that actually does analysis of artifacts, develops signatures, and is a single place to provide a clearinghouse for all the signatures developed by our industry partners as well as the department. We have an arrangement with clear defense contractors that participate in the voluntary program to actually share the classified threat context that explains the individual signatures. In addition to this information sharing arrangement, we have a DFARS now that actually makes it very clear the cybersecurity requirements that our industry partners must meet in order to protect DoD CUI, controlled unclassified information. And lastly, we have both voluntary and mandatory incident reporting requirements.
We're seeing similar issues in the healthcare sector. Healthcare organizations are often reluctant to share information about what they're seeing for cyber threats, and because HHS has a portion of the regulatory role. But we are working through that, partnering with DHS and the NCIC, who have worked hard for 10 years to mature automated threat indicator sharing and to get that out to the critical infrastructure sectors. HHS is trying to do something similar, take some of that threat information that applies to the healthcare sector, contextualize it and make it meaningful for the doctors and nurses and office managers who occupy about 80% of the healthcare space, and give them information they can use that they can understand to protect themselves. Automated threat indicator sharing is very valuable, and when consumed at machine speed by organizations that have the mature IT infrastructure or security staff to consume and take action on it, it's very valuable. But by and large, the majority of the healthcare sector is not that way. So HHS is leaning in as a sector-specific agency to work with ISACs and ISOWs and the healthcare vendor space to make meaning out of information sharing so that folks can use it in small, medium, rural settings, 1 and 2 doctor practices in your hometown. The collective awareness, preparedness, and resilience of the healthcare sector relies on information sharing. And I would advocate anybody in the room, part of an organization, to join an information sharing organization.
Excellent. One of our speakers this morning talked about the billions of IoT devices in the future. What I see from some of our customers today is a pragmatic problem of all the devices that exist today. And so ransomware, they have a lot of vulnerabilities. Many of these systems, factory automation, for example, I know one of the largest manufacturing companies in the US has a ransomware problem because of the automation tools are running Windows XP and things like that. Comments and thoughts about the role of industry and government with respect to not the future of IoT, but the present of all these devices. Chris?
Sure. So back to WannaCry, the medical devices, and it wasn't just confined to medical devices. There were endpoint systems, radiological scan and viewing systems that were affected by this, all built on older operating systems for good reason. They were cheap or free. Their graphic user interface looks familiar to a doctor or a clinician who's trying to operate the machine, but full of vulnerabilities that, if left unpatched or unmanaged, can cause a critical risk to a hospital or a healthcare organization's operations. So moving medical device manufacturers, working with the FDA, working with the consortiums out there to devise operating systems that are much more secure, that come with 2 open ports instead of 10,000, and burying medical devices or using stealth technology to hide them in a hospital network so that they can't be seen or found except for the person using them or the person maintaining them is probably the way to go.
So we're grappling with, we have a huge footprint of facilities that both afloat and ashore that have, of course, embedded within them all these systems, and we are in the process of bringing them all under our standard cybersecurity processes, including the risk management framework. Ultimately, the modernization of the underlying systems is a key responsibility of the cybersecurity processes of federal and business organizations. And just from the management of a office place IT as well as systems that we field, the maintenance of and modernization is a core cyber basic for the Department of Defense. So making sure that no longer supported operating systems are removed is a key objective.
Gentlemen, we were only given 15 minutes today. We could have gone on for another hour. I'd like everyone to thank our 2 panelists both for their participation and their service to the nation. Thank you very much.